There's a story in the Gospels about Jesus feeding the multitudes. By this point, Jesus had already grown in popularity because of his teaching and his healing, and he was followed by large crowds. They found themselves in a remote place with nothing to eat but a few pieces of bread and a couple of fish. And so, Jesus takes the bread, gives thanks, breaks it, and starts handing it to his disciples, who in turn hands it to the crowds. And he does the same for the fish. By the end of the story, all of them were filled and they had an abundance left to spare. If I were to ask you, how many men were fed on that day in that story, what would you say? If you said 5,000, then you'd be correct. But if you said 4,000, you'd be correct as well. Because this miracle didn't just happen once, it happened twice in two different locations with two different groups of people. The feeding of the 5,000 is different from the feeding of the 4,000. And let's compare them side by side. In the feeding of the 5,000, there were 5 loaves and 2 fish. By the end of the entire thing, there were 12 baskets of leftovers. And the entire thing took place by the shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is Jewish territory. In the feeding of the 4,000, there were 7 loaves and a few fish. There were 7 baskets of leftovers by the end of it, and the entire thing took place in the region of the Decapolis, which is a Gentile territory. In Mark chapter 8 verses 19 and 20, Jesus himself identifies these two distinct events. We read in the New Catholic Bible, "When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets filled with fragments did you collect? They answered, 12. When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets filled with fragments did you collect? They answered, 7. And what's more interesting is that in Greek, Jesus uses 2 different words for the baskets. He uses the word kophinos for the feeding of the 5,000 and the word spuris for the feeding of the 4,000. We'll talk more about why that matters later. So these are 2 separate events. But why does it matter? And what does it mean? We find the feeding of the 5,000 in all 4 Gospels, while the feeding of the 4,000 is only found in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. More people are familiar with the feeding of the 5,000, so I'll focus more on discussing the feeding of the 4,000. A very important detail is the difference in location. In Mark chapter 7 verse 31, it reads, "Returning from the region of Tyre, Jesus traveled by the way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis." This is 1 chapter before the feeding of the 4,000, and it mentions that Jesus was making his way to a region called the Decapolis. Decapolis in Greek comes from deca and polis. Deca meaning 10, just like how we use it in the term decagon, 10 sides. Polis means city. The Decapolis, 10 cities, was a Greco-Roman territory found in the east of the Jordan. These were not Jewish towns. These were filled with Greek influence, Greek language, Greek religion. This was Hellenistic culture. Earlier in the Gospel of Mark, this place is already mentioned. In Mark 5:20, it says, "The man then departed and began to make known throughout the Decapolis what Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed." The context of this passage is that Jesus heals a man who was possessed by a demon. And the way this entire thing takes place is that the demon inhabiting the man transfers itself into a herd of pigs. The fact that this territory contained a herd of pigs in the first place signals to us that this was not among the Jewish cities, because Jews do not eat pork. Pork was unclean for the Jews. This took place in or around the Decapolis, because after the encounter, the man who was freed from the influence of the demon spirit goes on to share about Jesus in the area of the Decapolis. Again, this was the territory of non-Jews, also known as Gentiles. We find this corroborated in Matthew's Gospel account. One verse prior to the feeding of the 4,000 in Matthew, we read in Matthew chapter 15 verse 31, "The crowds were amazed when they observed the mute speaking, the crippled made whole, the lame walking, and the blind with their sight restored, and they gave praise to the God of Israel." Notice what was happening. We see Jesus gaining popularity because of his works, because of his miracles. And what's particularly interesting about this verse is that last portion, that they gave praise to the God of Israel. Why is that interesting? Catholic Answers apologist Jimmy Akin writes, "This would be a strange thing to say if the audience were Jewish. Jews already glorified the God of Israel. They did it all the time. They worshipped him daily." So the fact that the passage mentions that they gave praise to the God of Israel implies that they must not have come from Israel. They were not Jews. So the people who were there in the feeding of the 4,000 were predominantly Gentiles. In contrast, the location of the feeding of the 5,000, which takes place earlier, is not mentioned by either Mark or Matthew. Where we find that information is with Luke. In Luke's account of the same story found in chapter 9 verse 10, it reads, "On their return, the apostles reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them and withdrew privately to a town named Bethsaida." Bethsaida was a fishing village on the Sea of Galilee. This was the hometown of Peter and Andrew. We can find that in John chapter 1, verse 44. In other words, this was Jewish territory. Long story short, the feeding of the 5,000 took place in Jewish territory with Jews present, while the feeding of the 4,000 took place in non-Jewish territory with Gentiles present. And we see this reflected even in the words used for basket, because apparently there were two kinds of baskets that were used. After the feeding of the 5,000, it was said that there were 12 baskets leftovers. The word for basket used here is the Greek word kophinos. This was a wicker basket associated with Jewish travelers to carry food. Why would they need to carry food? Well, they needed to keep their food clean or pure as they traveled among the Gentiles. Remember, the Jews had food laws. Not everything that's served on a Gentile table could be partaken of. In other words, these kophinos baskets were a means to set their food apart from the non-Jews. On the other hand, in the feeding of the 4,000, the word used for basket in Greek is a different word, and it's a different kind of basket. Here, the word used is spouris. And spouris refers to a large woven basket made of reed or rope. This was not a personal travel basket, unlike kophinos. This was a heavy cargo container of sorts. These baskets, the spouris, were so big that it could carry an entire person. In Acts chapter 9 verse 25, the Apostle Paul was carried within one of these baskets in order to lower him down the wall of Damascus. He did this in order to escape some of the Jews who were out to get him. And so we have a little basket and we have a large basket, the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And the numbers involved in the story matter as well. In the feeding of the 5,000, there were 12 baskets left over for the Jews. This matches the 12 tribes of Israel. On the other hand, in the feeding of the 4,000, there were 7 baskets left over for the Gentiles. 7 is the Jewish number for completion, such as in the 7 days of creation. And so what we find in these two stories, if you put them side by side, is that it is so rich with meaning and symbolism in the actual events that took place, but down to the details of said events, even in the manner that the gospel authors are writing about them, it is so rich. And the contrast is very apparent once you study them closely. Jesus was supposed to be the Jewish Messiah. The feeding of the 5,000 from that perspective makes sense. But the feeding of the 4,000 Well, it's as if Mark was telling his original audience that this crowd is not who you'd expect. Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, but his kingdom is not just for the Jews. And the Gospel of Mark itself establishes a sort of transition between Jesus doing this miracle for the 5,000, the Jewish audience, and him doing this miracle for the 4,000, the non-Jewish audience. Because in Mark chapter 7, which is the chapter in between the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, what we find in that sandwich chapter is this. First, Jesus gets into a disagreement with the Pharisees. About what? He gets into a disagreement about what counts as clean or unclean when it comes to food. Are you noticing the recurring pattern here? The reason why the Jews had their kophinos baskets with them is so that they could set apart their food. But Mark editorially notes in this chapter, as Jesus was having his disagreement with the Pharisee, that thus he, Jesus, pronounced all foods clean. The Jewish food laws were one of the things that separated them from the Gentiles, and we see this being challenged at this part of the story. After this, we find a story within the same chapter of Jesus praising the faith of a non-Jew, a Syro-Phoenician woman, a Gentile, and after which he heals her daughter. And so we have this exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees about what counts as clean or unclean, immediately followed by a personal encounter with a woman, a non-Jewish woman, wanting to receive healing as well from Christ. It is only after these two stories that Mark tells us that Jesus makes his way to the Decapolis, to the non-Jew territory. These two stories are the perfect setup for the miracle that he was about to do for the Gentiles. And so let's get to that. In Mark chapter 8 verses 1 to 3, again reading from the New Catholic Bible, it says, "In those days, a great crowd had again assembled, and they had nothing to eat. Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, 'I am moved with compassion for these people, because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will collapse on the way, and some of them have come from far off.'" Jesus says this to the disciples, inviting them to the problem, inviting them to his compassion. And then we find the disciples' response. In chapter 8, verse 4, it reads, "His disciples replied, 'How can anyone find enough bread here in this deserted place to feed these men?'" You know, this has always stood out to me ever since I learned that there were two feeding of the multitude stories. Because these disciples have already seen Jesus feed a group of 5,000. They were the ones who handed out the bread. They were the ones who saw that there were 12 baskets of leftover by the end of it. And so, why are they acting as if Jesus couldn't do it again for this group and solve the problem? If they already saw Jesus feeding the 5,000, why are they so worried about him feeding 4,000? The Gospels do not give us an explicit answer. They do not tell us what was happening inside of their minds. They just show us the events as they unfold. But here are some possibilities that we can consider. Perhaps the disciples just forgot. In the heat of the moment, we don't always remember what we're meant to remember. This could happen to us until today. When we are faced with high-pressure situations, do we always remember what Jesus taught us? Maybe not always. Or perhaps they were still getting to know Jesus and they were still discovering the kinds of things that he was capable of doing. And so they weren't sure. Or perhaps they just didn't want to impose. Because last time Jesus did the miracle, and so they didn't want to feel like they were expecting Jesus to do the same again for this situation. Jesus already did that before. Maybe this time, we're supposed to solve the problem. But my reading, my personal reading, based on the common thread that we've been tracing through these stories, is this. Perhaps the reason why the disciples seemed like they were at a loss is because they weren't expecting Jesus to do the same for the Gentiles as he did for the Jews. After all, isn't Jesus the Jewish Messiah? And they knew that. They knew that Jesus was the Messiah for the Jews. But could he be the Messiah for the Gentiles too? My reading is that perhaps they didn't connect those dots yet. And it kind of makes sense from their background because by this point of the story, the Jewish people had fought hard in order to preserve their lineage and their heritage. They have fought hard to keep themselves apart. They have faced exile and wars and defeats and Greek influence that challenged them to compromise, that challenged them to give up their culture. The idea that the Jewish Messiah would feed the Gentiles in the same way that he fed the Jews might have been outside the frame of what they were expecting him to do. And so what Jesus does is he asks the question that he asked them before. How many loaves do you have? So far, the disciples were focused on what they did not have. There's not enough bread. This is a deserted place. There's too many people. And we do that too, don't we? We often get too stuck on what we do not have that we lose sight of what we do have. And more importantly, whom we do have. Because the disciples did not have enough bread, but they had Jesus with them. And that makes all the difference. And so Jesus asks them, well, what do you have? You've told me what you don't have, but what do you have? 7 loaves and a few fish. In their hands, they were looking at these bread and fish, and it wasn't enough. But in the hands of Jesus, it was plenty. And so in Mark chapter 8, verses 6 to 8, we read, Jesus ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the people. There were also a few small fish, and after blessing them, he commanded that these too should be distributed. They ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up the fragments left over, 7 full baskets. Pay attention to those 4 movements. Jesus took, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. These are the same 4 movements that we find in the Last Supper. These are the same 4 movements performed by the priest at the altar during every Mass. What Jesus does for this Gentile crowd in the wilderness is a preview of what he will do for the entire world at Calvary and in the Eucharist. It is after the feeding of the 4,000, after Jesus shows that his plan of salvation is a door open for everyone, that Peter, for the first time, confesses that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. And it is only after this that Jesus tells them what being the Messiah is all about. Later in the same chapter, in verse 31, we read, after that, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must endure great suffering, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be put to death, and rise again after 3 days. If you think that Jesus' target audience, that apparently it involved the Gentiles, was surprising enough for his Jewish followers, what more his intended method? That he saw himself not as a Messiah, king, warrior who would defeat the Romans and set the people free, but he rather saw himself as one who would give his life for the sake of love, and yet death would not be the end of his story. It was precisely these moments that prepared his disciples for the mission that they had ahead of them. to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey all that He has commanded. This is the often overlooked story of the feeding of the 4,000. It's not the same as the feeding of the 5,000, and that's important. Yes, Jesus did the same miracle twice. No, it wasn't because He ran out of ideas. He did so many others more. But it was because He was making a point about the scope of His kingdom, who it includes, and the means by which this kingdom is coming here on earth, through self-giving love that ends not in death, but in life. Now, how about you? How many loaves do you have? That is it for today. God bless.